Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for having me. It's interesting to start with a comic. Quite often when we're confronted with really complex technological issues, somebody decides to basically create a comic. A friend of mine I worked with in synthetic biology did a whole comic book called The Adventures in Synthetic Biology. So I thought it'd be interesting just to share this with you. And the question that you've asked, can I answer this question, was a question that somebody put to me. I actually got funding from the Internet Society Foundation, and they said, "Can you answer this question? I mean, what about quantum computing? We've heard a lot about it. Is it going to change the world?" And so what I'm basically going to do is kind of go through my thought process over the past 6 months, and it hasn't ended. I haven't stopped working on quantum computing, but I'll share with you kind of the ways I've been thinking about it over the past 6 months or so as I kind of slog through this field. So, I'll do a short detour in terms of, okay, what is this, right? So quantum computing, is essentially, you can imagine, I've got these golf balls here. So instead of having ones and zeros, like one and a zero, we have what are known as qubits instead of bits. And so it's possible to represent sort of multiple combinations of zeros and ones. One can imagine essentially a surface of this entire sphere that now becomes part of the computational infrastructure. And you can have those in multiple positions. And then you can actually, if you get lucky enough, combine these two together. And so you have a computational system that goes up exponentially in terms of exactly what it's capable of doing. The problem with this is that it's very, very fragile. And so in order to keep it sustained, you effectively have to cool it down to close to absolute zero, which is minus 173 degrees Celsius. People use lasers, and quite often these qubits simply decay and they disappear, and you lose them. So it's an incredibly difficult, both scientific and engineering problem. I think we're coming closer to being able to do this, but as these qubits interact, there's a lot of errors. And so one of the big problems is correcting all the errors that come into the system, and they use other qubits to do this. So this issue of quantum error correction is a huge bottleneck in kind of moving the field forward. But nevertheless, there's a lot of people super excited about this, right? It almost seems too good to be true. They're going to change the world. McKinsey put out a report sort of saying that they could reduce our carbon output by 7 gigatons by 2035. It's a bigger discovery than fire or the internet. It's going to be transformational. Anybody that's done any work in technology sort of knows, they've heard this before. Certainly AI was going to do the same thing. Then if you go back a little bit further, it was nanotech, robots, microbes, gene editing, just fill in the blank. So this is pretty typical when new technologies appear, that you hear a lot of this, what some people refer to as hype, right? And so there's actually ways of looking at this. This is the famous Gartner hype cycle, comes out every year, great expectations. And they just plot lots of technologies that are, basically people are beginning to talk about. And then quantum computing was on the hype cycle curve in 2012, 2018, then it kind of disappeared. But basically, you have these triggers and they go up this hype curve, and quite often the expectations aren't met. People are disappointed. People pull funding out of the area, and it goes into this kind of valley of death. And some technologies make it out, and quite often they make it out because people begin to see these technologies solving real problems that we care about. So there's the emergence of real use cases, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the interesting things I think about quantum computing is even when you talk to the quantum scientists, they attack each other. There's too much hype here. People think these are just around the corner. And I'll come back to this. It's a huge difference between just around the corner and 10 years from now. So we really need to think about the time frameworks. But there's also, this is a colleague of mine that does a lot of work on the history of science and tech. There's a reason for hype, and hype is not necessarily a bad thing. And a lot of researchers and entrepreneurs have been taught that a little bit of hype helps get you more venture capital money and more research grants and more attention and more press coverage. So the question is not, is it necessarily good or bad, but the question is, how much is there? And can you see around the hype? So I'm going to spend probably maybe a half an hour just trying to answer these 5 questions. And these are the questions that have been bothering me for 6 months. Is this hype or not? I mean, how much hype is there? Is this realistic as a technology? And I'll share with you a number of metrics I've used to try to sort this out. If quantum computers emerge, what could they accomplish for the planet that existing computers can't, supercomputers, or other technologies? This is another question we don't ask. I mean, is there some solution in the biotech space or the nanotech space that could actually solve this problem we're facing? We don't need quantum computing for this. This issue of timing, right? I mean, we're running out of time, options, and decades. We don't have a lot of time. And so how long is it going to take? And then I'll talk a bit about the question that always comes up with computers is how much energy do they use? And, you know, are these computers going to be energy intensive? Are they going to save us energy? And in the end, I'll talk a little bit about, you know, what kind of policies could we be pursuing now that might be useful and advantageous, even though the technology might just be emerging. So let me start with is it hype or not, right? So the first thing one can look at is the investments. So if you go back to 2018, people were forecasting what they called a quantum winter. People had talked earlier of the AI winter. Money was just drying up. This is also the point where governments were starting to invest more. The European Quantum Flagship Project was launched. The Chinese had a lot of investments. Nobody knows exactly how much money the Chinese are investing. Some estimates I've seen are over $20 billion in quantum computing. The US is investing here. If you look at the new CHIPS Act that they just passed, there's $153 million for quantum. The interesting thing is what happened to the venture capital money. And you could see it going up significantly after 2018 and now reaching about $1 billion a year. And so that's had a very significant impact on the business ecosystem. Because before this, we were talking about Google and Microsoft, Honeywell, IBM. These were the big players in quantum. But now the whole space is flooded with enormous numbers of startups. I can't keep track of them. I've graphed some of them here on this chart. So you see this expanding ecosystem of startup firms, and this actually indicates the emergence, I think, of a healthy innovation ecosystem. That all of a sudden you have lots of firms, they're pursuing different kinds of approaches to quantum computing. They're focusing on different kinds of solution problems or case studies. And the key here is, have they gone through from Series A to Series B venture capital funding, right? Series A could be 20 to 30 million, Series B, 40 to 60, 70 million. But we know from innovation studies that once you get past Series A, that your chances of actually launching a successful company go up significantly. And there are a few companies that have actually gone public. So they've actually made it to the other end of this. And people will criticize and say, well, these companies aren't making any profit yet. But you have to keep in mind that it took 14 years for Amazon to actually have a net profit. So I think I would make the argument that this is quite different from what we saw even 4 or 5 years ago. There's companies in the US, there's companies in Israel, Germany, Canada. So it's an international ecosystem, and it's growing pretty significantly, and it's attracting an awful lot of private capital. So this is something I think that's quite different and quite good, because it means you're going to run a lot of experiments. Some of these will fail, but you have the capacity to actually learn from the experiments and move on. And that's a very different system that we had 5 or 6 years ago when you only had these large tech companies playing. The computers are actually increasing in performance. I think, again, there's a lot of hype about what they can do, but generally the curve is going up. So we started with these little machines, 4 or 5 qubits. Now, people are talking about 100, 200,000 qubit machines. So, again, I would temper this with some caution. I'm not sure when it's going to be reached, but at least the curve is moving in an upward direction. And I think technology is the performance is going up. That means they're dealing better with error correction, and they're getting more usable qubits that they can apply to problems. The last thing I would say is that you're seeing expanding use cases. And when we looked at the hype curve, this was one of the keys to actually getting out of that valley of death. So you have people developing the hardware The other thing I would say is that quantum computers need quantum algorithms. You can't run normal programs on these computers. You can't really take an algorithm that's running on an IBM machine and pop it into the Google machine. So you need development of algorithms. And if you're interested in the algorithm side, there's something called a quantum algorithm zoo that you can find on the internet. They had about, I think, 200 publicly accessible algorithms for quantum computers up there in 2016. Now it's more than doubled. And the other thing is you need to focus this on basically, focusing on applicable problems, things that people are actually interested in. So there's two areas, I think, environmentally relevant areas that are potentially game changers for quantum computing. The first are what people call quadratic allocation problems. This is how do we allocate resources in complex dynamic networks? So what happens when you have lots of parts of the system, lots of nodes changing, lots of things moving around? So this affects, obviously, traffic routing, logistics systems, the management of a modernized energy grid, where the energy grid might be working bidirectionally, where we're putting energy in and out from thousands of different storage capacities, electric vehicles, you've got intermittent sources hooked up. So you can see, I mean, Volkswagen is doing an interesting project with quantum computing in Portugal on traffic routing. Here's another company in Canada that's using it to improve in-store logistics. So you're beginning to see, as I say, some use cases. And the other one is simulation. So can we actually use quantum computers to simulate, quantum systems at atomic levels? So Mercedes-Benz is now doing some work with one of the startups on lithium-ion batteries. Microsoft is working on fertilizer production, improving the catalytic processes. There's other areas that people are talking about, for instance, carbon capture technologies, fuel cell technologies. These are all areas might benefit from the ability to actually simulate at an atomic level molecular systems and how they behave. So you have this expanding use cases. So these three things, you've got more money, you've got an expanding and I think very heterogeneous innovation ecosystem. Computers are getting better, and you actually have some interesting kinds of proof of concepts coming out. So what does that mean for a realistic timeline? I think, for the next 10, potentially up to 20 years, you're going to have a lot of these computers that have a lot of fault, error correction needs in them. They will do probably in the next 5 years, lots of proof of concepts. You may see the beginning of commercial applications. But my timeline looks more like this than, you're going to solve a lot of the climate issues in the next 5 to 10 years. So it may take 15 or 20 years to the point we get to a quantum computer that looks and behaves like a computer we have, where it's kind of programmable. We're not having to use enormous amounts of computational infrastructure to get rid of errors. The other thing that happens is there are quantum computers that are used as simulators for quantum systems. So you have a quantum computer that essentially simulates an actual quantum system. And those, I think, will continue to be used. You'll have digital and analog systems that evolve simultaneously. So I think this is, as I say, after 5 or 6 months of playing around with this is kind of my timeline. That means I don't think you're going to have significant solutions to, sort of environmental applications in the next 5 to 10 years. I think you'll have lots of very interesting proof of concepts. So one of the questions is, can it beat supercomputers, right? And, this is the classic curve from Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive technologies. When they appear, it's very difficult to understand what their potential is. And part of that is that quite often they underperform existing technologies that are already out there. What we don't tend to see clearly is the shape of this red curve, how steep it is, and whether as you go up that curve, it allows you to do things you couldn't do before. So as we became very, very good at putting more and more computer storage in a smaller space, all of a sudden we had the capacity to make laptops and then put 1,000 songs in our pocket and then 100,000. So it actually changes our capacity to do things we can never do before. The problem you have, and this people sort of define this point of quantum advantage as the point this was the goal, was the quantum system is going to beat the supercomputer. And of course, in 2019, we heard this claim from Google that their quantum computer had crunched a problem that would have taken 10,000 years for a supercomputer to solve. And 2 days later, IBM came back and said, no, our supercomputer can do that in 2 days. And so you have this oscillating kind of these battles internally with the companies. Have we reached that point? It's very, very convenient to sort of say, this is the point, right? And when you see that in nuclear fusion, when do we reach this point where the actual amount of energy being created by a fusion reactor is greater than the amount of energy needed to sustain the fusion reaction? So a lot of times in technology areas, people are searching for this point where things just, you set the benchmark, you reach it, and now you've succeeded. The problem is that this moves. So it's not like the people working on supercomputers are just sitting there waiting for the quantum folks to get their act together. And so, here's what's happened just in the last month. So a supercomputer is finally, with the help of AI and sort of deep neural network learning, solved the protein folding problem. This was kind of the holy grail. One of the grand challenges of computing is to simulate the folding of actual proteins. Non-trivial problem. You have to simulate around 30,000 atoms that are essentially interacting electrostatically. And that's 450 million pairs, and it has to be done kind of in real time or near real time so you can actually simulate the folds. So all of a sudden, this was, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, somebody said, we actually have been able to do this, but it was a supercomputer working with a deep, sort of deep learning neural network that did it. 2 weeks ago, we saw a supercomputer, again with AI, solve this. So this is a 100,000 equation quantum physics problem. It was reduced to 4 equations. So this would have been a classic thing for the quantum people to solve, but the supercomputer people were using AI solved it. So one of the issues is, okay, if we start looking at some of the environmental issues that we're facing, where's quantum computing going to make a big difference? And is it going to make a difference faster than supercomputers? The other question is it going to outperform other technologies? So, people have said, well, we can use quantum computing to understand nitrogen chemistry, and that's going to improve fertilizer production efficiencies. A hugely important thing, both from an environmental standpoint and from a food security standpoint. But the biologists have already started working on this, and they've been working on it for a decade. So the idea is to replace synthetic nitrogen with something better that just uses natural processes. There are a number of plants that produce their own nitrogen, or they can actually extract atmospheric nitrogen, beans and legumes. So the people in the biotech space have been able to actually extract that genetic function, and they use a combination of AI, robotics, and large genetic function libraries, and reprogram it and put it into crops like corn. So this is, to me, again, a set of game-changing technology. We don't need a quantum computer to do this. Companies like Pivot Bio already have a product on the market. And so we don't have to wait for the quantum folks to get their act together, because we already have a product on the market, and it's quite interesting in the sense that we're using natural processes rather than continuing to use synthetic fertilizers that require large hydrocarbon inputs. So I think this is not a question or set of questions that's unique to quantum computing. I mean, every time there's a new technology out there, we should be asking the question, does it perform as good as the other technologies in that space? Or are we putting too much attention on this technology and forgetting about competing technologies that already may be better positioned to solve a problem in another sector, right? So I want to make sure this is kind of a generic problem with technology assessment. So this is the other thing that I think plays a role is that, there's a quote from John Seeley Brown, who ran the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And it's so this idea that people thinking about new markets sort of count 1, 2, 3 a million, right? So there's tendency quite often in the computer science space, a lot of technology spaces, to kind of overestimate consumer demand and underestimate the amount of effort that you need to sort of invest to get into the market. So, again, quantum computing has been talked about to create new drug candidates. There's been a study that just came out that looked at 10,000 cases, drug trials, and the average time to get a drug through the FDA process in the US is 10.5 years. It requires probably $1 billion, and there's probably only one drug out of 10,000 that makes large profits for pharmaceutical companies. So you have to take what's going on in the quantum space and say, okay, how long does it take to scale the computer? And then even if you have an innovation, you have to say, okay, now what? Right? So it may have to go through regulatory review. That just gets it into the market. It doesn't mean it's going to scale in the market. So this is a huge issue. Friends of mine in the biotech space, yes, will tell me, we can go from grams to kilograms. The killer is going from kilograms to kilotons or gigatons, because that's what you're going to need to sort of solve some of the environmental problems. Fertilizers in the US, 3 to 10 years. Once they're out there, you face enormous problems with the farmers in terms of switching costs. Economic problems about actually, how can we invest in the new technology, but a lot of them are psychological. I've been using the same fertilizers for 10 years. I'm not going to change now. It's just too risky for me. Novel chemicals, 1 to 3 years, depending on how novel it is. The more novel it is, quite often, the more it's regulated. So there tends to be kind of an internal bias towards novelty in a lot of the regulations. If you're doing this in the EU, you have to go through REACH, which is probably a little faster than in the US, but it still probably would add 1, 2, 3 years, and obviously dealing with the EU bureaucracy. Batteries, no batteries going into a car without massive amounts of testing. And the EU is changing its battery regulations now, so that throws a lot of uncertainty into the system for investors and for startups. So you have to take this whole issue of scaling quantum and say, okay, what are we going to innovate with it, and add sort of the amount of time it takes to get it into the market, and then the amount of time it would actually you'd need to sort of scale it up to have a large impact on environmental quality, whether we're talking about reduction in nitrogen pollution, whether we're talking about reduction in carbon. Logistics might be a faster one. So part of what the sort of the exercise is to sort of say, well, if we're going to use quantum computing to deal with some of these problems, what areas might we actually enter the market faster, that we don't have this kind of loading at the back end? So if you put, the sort of the time it takes to scale up on top of the regulatory time, I mean, you're out sometimes 10, 15 years, right? And this is the piece that most technology optimists don't talk about. And this is why it's really important when you're sort of doing these kinds of exercises to talk to the people that actually regulate the end products. So problem is most of you know we're running out of time, and this is the probability that countries are going to achieve their carbon reduction goals under the Paris Agreement. Doesn't look good, right? And probably we don't know, because this study I think is about 2 years old. The impact of the war in Ukraine, obviously lots of things are changing that could have positive benefits in the medium term in terms of switching to more renewables and away from fossil fuels. But this changes it, and the U.S. Would have to reduce its carbon output probably by half in 10 years, which is a huge amount. And you can see kind of where these countries are. That's just carbon, right? And so if you look at the work on planetary boundaries that comes out of the Stockholm Resilience Institute, we've already exceeded what they believe are the planetary thresholds for lots of other areas. So, endangered species, fresh water, phosphate loading, nitrogen loading. So this whole issue of we're playing kind of catch up. And the question is, what role would quantum play in that catch up? And does it play an important role in the next 10 years? Or is the International Energy Agency says there's going to be a whole bunch of technologies that probably will play significant roles after 2035 or 2040. And I would tend to put quantum computing in sort of in that basket. People will say, well, is it going to use a lot of energy? This was an interesting article. Quantum computing could change the way the world uses energy. The first title that was on this article is, we'll run out of energy in 20 years if we don't switch to quantum computing. And the people that published the article says, we're not publishing this article with that title. And they pushed back on the author and said, you need to change this. The author was a CEO of a quantum company. That's not surprising, right? So I've been looking for data on sort of quantum computing energy use for for months now, I haven't found a lot. There was an interesting study that was done at the National Renewable Energy Lab at the Department of Energy, where they took these different platforms for doing quantum computing and they compared them. And you can see, obviously, their estimates are 40% of the energy use will be just keeping these systems cool. And the more you take them down towards absolute zero, the more energy they're going to use. So the systems like Google's that are really based on superconducting at near absolute zero are probably going to use more energy than some of the other systems. Microsoft is working on a system that will function at much higher temperatures, right? So I think this is interesting, but I think the real interesting piece is the avoided energy. So this is the result of one experiment that was run. They came up with a problem, they threw some supercomputers at it, and they compared it to a quantum computer. And you could see the massive difference in the amount of energy to run the problem. So again, this was kind of this was a benchmark that they set up that was kind of an abstract benchmark. But I think there's two things. How much energy will be used by quantum computing? Personally, I'm not worried about that. I think the big issue is kind of how much would you save? The other thing that's important to remember is this kind of artificial battle between quantum computers and supercomputers is a myth, right? So one can imagine the quantum computers are going to be integrated into hybrid computing systems, hyperscale data centers, and they'll work with classical supercomputers. They may be parallelized, but in parallel, for instance, and the quantum computer's role here will be to take on those parts of a problem that are computationally intensive. So you can imagine the quantum computer functioning almost like an accelerator, the way we have a graphic processor unit in a lot of our computers when we're faced with lots of image processing. So I think this is a much more realistic portrayal of how they may be used in the future. It's not a battle between supercomputers and quantum, but how they may be integrated into hyperscale data centers, offered to people in the cloud, for instance. But I think this whole issue of energy is one that we need to at least keep on our radar screen, because I could not find a lot of data. So let me just end with a few possible things that might be done now. I think this energy use one is worth thinking about, because I think there's a lot of work on what people are calling sustainable computing. People are worried about the energy use of computation for machine learning algorithms, data center energy use. So one could begin to at least think about what kind of metrics would we need to actually measure kind of both the energy used and the avoided energy of quantum as it becomes integrated into large computational centers. The other thing that would be, I think, interesting exercise is to bring together people from the quantum world with people from essentially the problem holders in the environmental and sustainability world, to think about how could we use quantum in ways that would be radically different from the supercomputer and would actually solve some important problems, and how would you accelerate their deployment and adaptation quickly? So you're trying to get these out quicker than normal. And defining kind of a subset of quantum computing applications. So there's already one company that's doing this. iQuantum is one of the startups. So they've decided to build partnerships with government, with nonprofits, to develop actually quantum computing solutions and apply that to decarbonization. So you begin to think, people are beginning to actually think about this. But I think we could do a much better job of beginning to shape public-private partnerships by bringing people in these two worlds together. And they don't meet often, right? I mean, I would say that I know that from working in other tech spaces, that these people are often separated by discipline and by institution and inclination. The other thing that would be interesting is just having an inventory of how are we using quantum computing in environmental and sustainability spaces. I've been looking around for examples. I found a few, but there's no kind of one spot, kind of one-stop shop where I can see, okay, here's a sense of where we are. Here's some things that are already being used at a proof of concept stage. Here's some things that are being thought about, some stuff that appears in the literature. I was involved in a project with the Academy of Sciences, and one of the things that came out of this was we produced an online inventory of emerging bioengineered products. So you can go in and actually do horizon scanning and see, okay, what what applications, where is gene editing being used in what sectors and for what? Is it on the market? Is it close to commercialization? Is it sort of an early stage research idea? So I think having some kind of inventory of what's going on in the quantum / sustainability space would be interesting. And the other one that clearly comes up and is always talked about is who has access to this, and is access likely to be equitable, and is there a diverse participation in the research space, development, commercialization, and use. And I mentioned, there's been kind of bumps in the road for quantum. There were significant attacks on the field when they started using the word quantum supremacy. Okay, I talked about quantum advantage. So there was a big article, a letter that went into Nature magazine criticizing the quantum folks about the use of the word supremacy and all the undertones on this. The other thing that popped out was this quantum gender initiative, because a lot of the researchers that are doing this tend to be, white males. And there was very, very little representation from other groups. Obviously, there was seems to be a lot of gender bias. There are groups that just simply weren't represented in the space. So the issue then becomes, well, how do we have a sort of an ethical computing culture? What kind of values are being embedded into the quantum computing development and commercialization space that might impact, what these folks focus on, how much money flows into the space, who gets research funding. So I think that's another whole set of larger issues that falls into the kind of sort of science and social science space. And this, I think, still has yet to be solved. I mean, I think it'll be an ongoing problem. Anyway, that's as far as I got in 6 months. I'm not sure I answered the question, Volker. I think, going back, is it going to save the planet? No, I don't think so. And it's probably not going to have a huge impact in the near term. But, going out 10, 15 years, there's no doubt in my mind that this is real. It's significant, and it will play a role. And that we actually, by thinking of this now, we might be able to shape it so that the role actually increases, and that we might be able to actually move quantum computing into the sort of the sustainability space faster than it normally would go, and target some of the capacities and advantages of quantum computing towards particular problems that are incredibly difficult to solve computationally. The only other thing I would say that you need to keep in mind is a lot of the money going into the space is not focused on developing planet-saving applications. It's focused on encryption. Right? This is what basically got people interested / worried about quantum computing, was that these quantum computers could essentially penetrate a lot of the encryption systems that we use for data security. And so that also means that a lot of the research that's going on here is probably is highly classified, and we don't even see it. And some of it might be defensive kinds of research. So the US just ran a large open competition to develop quantum resistant encryption algorithms. And some of it is no doubt offensive, that people are trying to figure out, nation states, other potential bad actors, who knows, how to use quantum computing to penetrate existing encryption systems, which could have massive implications, both going backwards in terms of the way we protect data with encryption, past data, but also going forward. So when you're thinking about this, the genesis of quantum computing is somewhat different from a lot of other areas. And there's a large national security overlay here that quite often is kind of impenetrable at this point in time. But those people are in the space, and they will play a role in what happens probably over the next 10 or 15 years. Thank you.